All right, welcome to the conversation. Now we're going to tell you about how foreign oligarchs might be raising housing prices so that they are unaffordable and destroying Midwestern towns. What do they have to do with us, and how would they affect America? Well, good thing we have Michel on. He is he's the author of American Kleptocracy: How the U.S. Created the World's Greatest Money Laundering Scheme in History. Well, that's unfortunate, but real. So Casey, welcome.
Jane, great to be here. Thanks so much.
No problem. So a lot to get to. Let's get started. So conventionally, I, like a lot of people for a while, thought Cayman Islands, Switzerland, these are where you have your money laundering operations and your banks that hide them. Wealthy people hide their money, basically, right? How did it get to be America that's leading in this category?
Yeah, look, I mean, Jake, you're not wrong. I think when a lot of people think of the offshoring economy, financial secrecy, they think of places like Switzerland or Panama or places in the Caribbean or South Pacific. But lo and behold, as we've seen over the past few decades, there's been a transformation so few of us have been paying attention to, and that it is now the United States of America. There's actually the world's biggest offshore haven that's actually begun sucking up so much business from these traditional offshore finance havens of yore. There's three primary ways that this happened. This is a process that took place over decades. This didn't happen overnight. There were concerted efforts from legislators, from industries that made this a new reality. The United States of America is not just the world's biggest economy, it's also the world's biggest offshore and financial secrecy haven. There's three primary areas that I write about in the book that allowed that transformation. One, you got to look at the states, not the federal government itself. It was actually the states that led this. States like Delaware, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nevada, these kind of smaller states that created the financial incentive structure, the kinds of anonymous shell companies, anonymous trusts that attracted the inflows of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, and potentially more from, again, oligarchs, autocrats, these despotic regimes around the world into the United States. You got the states themselves leading these developments. You got anti-money laundering loopholes and exemptions, not for American banks. American banks are actually relatively clean in terms of foreign illicit money, but we're talking about things like real estate. We're talking about things like private equity and hedge funds. We're talking about the art market and auction houses, all of which enjoy exemptions from basic anti-money laundering regulations. You got the states, and you got these exemptions, and then you got the actual Americans on the ground. Those that we call the enablers that are enabling these illicit financial flows, are incentivizing these financial flows and are profiting from it. So these are the real estate agencies, the private equity managers, there's the accountants and escrow agents and hedge fund managers, as well as maybe most especially lawyers. Because the lawyers are the ones setting up the shell companies, setting up the trusts, skirting around basic anti-money laundering regulations, and then beyond that, intimidating investigative journalists that are looking into these networks and that are lobbying for their kleptocratic clients in Washington, and then cloaking all of this behind attorney-client privilege. So you have this whole cast of American professionals that has helped create and entrench this new offshoring reality right here in the United States of America.
So Casey, I understand the states, they want to get foreign money into their state. And a lot of them run by Republicans don't care at all about scruples, morals, illegal activities. And it's a race to the bottom. Oh yeah, I'll give you more protection than South Dakota does. I get it, right? The individuals, they're gonna make money. You're a real estate agent. What do you care if it's an oligarch buying it or somebody else buying it? You're gonna make money, so you're incentivized to say yes. I understand that. The part in the middle is the interesting part. The money laundering exceptions for real estate and other parts of the economy. How did that happen?
Yeah, Jake, that's a great question. Part of the book details with the broader history of the American anti-money laundering efforts, right? These policies and regulations that prevent so much, or tried to prevent so much illicit finance coming to the US. We actually have to go back 2 decades, to 2001, 2002, the passage of the Patriot Act, of all things. Now, I don't need to tell you in the audience all of these civil liberties violations and concerns from the Patriot Act. There's a part of the Patriot Act that is actually incredibly progressive in terms of anti-money laundering regulations. There's a clear argument to be made that the Patriot Act is actually the single greatest piece of anti-money laundering legislation ever passed in the US because of what it did to the American banking sector. It forced American banks to set up internal anti-money laundering checks. It forced American banks to no longer work with the proceeds of foreign corruption. It had this wonderful slate of policies implemented because of the Patriot Act. Again, leaving everything else in the Patriot Act to the side. It also addressed a number of other industries in the US as well. It addressed real estate, it addressed private equity, hedge funds, escrow accounts, a whole range of other industries that have begun seeing by 2001, 2002, this new kind of tidal wave of illicit finance coming to the US. The problem was, shortly after the Patriot Act passage, the Bush Treasury Department decided to issue a series of exemptions for not the banking industry itself, but for, again, real estate, private investment, hedge funds, escrow agents, art and auction houses, et cetera, et cetera. And they did this. There was a logic to it. They issued these exemptions from these new anti-money laundering regulations because they said they wanted to see the effect on these industries. They didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And these new exemptions, they said, were going to be temporary. And you can kind of see, again, the logic of it. They don't want to cut these industries off at the knees. They want to know what the actual impact's going to be. The problem is those temporary exemptions are now 2 decades old. They're not temporary anymore. They're temporary only in name. These are, in effect, permanent exemptions. And that have been continued and entrenched by administration after administration. The Obama administration didn't do anything with these exemptions. Certainly the Trump administration didn't do anything with these exemptions. It's only in the last few weeks, actually, that the Biden administration is finally vocally addressing, we haven't seen it in terms of policy, but in terms of rhetoric, finally beginning to address some of these exemptions themselves. Because we know what the result of these exemptions have been. The real estate industry in America, both the residential real estate as well as commercial real estate, have ballooned into this go-to source for anonymous wealth, dirty money, illicit finance that allows foreign oligarchs, foreign kleptocrats to cycle so much of their money through and strip any identifying information from other investigators, or that other investigators can track, tax authorities can track, regulators can track. We know that this same dynamic has played out in industry after industry after industry right here in the United States of America because of, again, these exemptions that are now 20 years old.
So, Casey, there's a lot to unpack there, but I feel like real estate's been used for money laundering for a long time, including when Russian oligarchs bought a giant percentage of Trump Tower when he was in massive trouble, and that was, I believe, pre 9/11. So, but for the people at home that don't know how money laundering works, they've got to be asking, why are they buying American real estate? How does that help them?
Well, look, there's a couple reasons for that. One, America is still nominally a rule of law jurisdiction. It has still relatively fair courts, a fair judiciary. You're not going to bribe a judge and allow that judge then allow whomever it might be to seize that asset. There are private property protections still in the United States of America. There is a significant legal class, legal professionals that can defend those assets on behalf of whichever kleptocratic client they would like. Again, lawyers have no anti-money laundering, no due diligence requirements whatsoever. We're not talking about representation in court. Everybody's due equal, has equal due in court. I'm talking about everything else that the lawyers in the US are doing on behalf of kleptocratic clients. So there are all these different reasons that the US has become this preferred jurisdiction for laundering operations, for illicit finance, for the transformation of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, if not more, if not trillions of dollars of dirty money transformed into licit, legitimate assets that are still controlled by those initial kleptocratic, oligarchy, despotic figures that can still profit from them, that can still skirt sanctions with them, but that cannot actually be tracked back to the initial source, cannot actually be tracked back to those initial kleptocratic figures. I mean, I don't need to tell audiences the size, the scope of the real estate industry in and of itself, to say nothing of the American private equity or hedge fund industry. I mean, these are massive, trillions of dollars industries that enjoy no due diligence, no money laundering or anti-money laundering requirements whatsoever. There's every reason in the world it would attract all of this illicit finance into the United States of America. And then, oh, by the way, it's no longer just in the Manhattans or the Miamis or the Malibus that we kind of traditionally associate with this wealth. You know, Cenk, as you mentioned right at the beginning of our conversation, these guys are now plowing money, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, into the American Midwest, into the Rust Belt, into commercial real estate, into steel plants, manufacturing plants, you name it. Any part of the American real estate sector is almost effectively wide open for as much illicit money to come in as they would want.
So Casey, let me understand this right. So it could be someone who is part of a drug cartel or somehow got illicit funds in Russia for doing organized crime. It could be any of one of those illicit sources, right? And they don't want the money traced back to their drug cartel. So they come in here and they say, hey, I want to buy $1 billion worth of real estate. And at the end, whatever that property is, or whatever the group is that bought it for them, winds up being legal. And they go, what? I have a shopping mall in Minnesota. I don't know what you're talking about. And so the trick there is for the guy who's arranging that deal, private equity or whoever, to not ask any questions about where the money's coming from, right? That's where the exception to the rule that banks have, where they have to ask, hey, where is this money coming from?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Shane. It's the private equity managers, the hedge fund investors, the American lawyers, the shell company operators, the trust operators, again, in states like Delaware or South Dakota that have perfected the art of the perfect anonymous financial vehicle to, again, strip any identifying information and then use that financial vehicle, that anonymous financial vehicle, to plow hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars into, to take just one industry, the American real estate sector, which is, again, trillions and trillions of dollars a wide industry in and of itself. I mean, it is ludicrously easy to launder funds in the United States of America, regardless of the source of income. If you're an oligarch, if you are a narco trafficker, a wildlife poacher, an arms trafficker, a human trafficker, anybody who has any dirty money can come directly to the United States of America, use private equity, use American lawyers who can then use their own attorney-client account to skirt those basic anti-money laundering regulations. I didn't mean to write a book that is a playbook for how these guys can do this. But that's really what it is. It is as wide open as anything. Okay,
so Casey, real quick as we're running out of time here. So what does that have to do with decimating Midwestern towns, people would ask?
Yeah, so that's a great question. When we think of these kleptocratic figures, again, we think of these high net worth individuals, conspicuous consumption, private jets, fleets of supercars, mansions in Malibu, and that's certainly a reality. But one of the things we have seen, and we're only just beginning to learn about, is especially after the 2008 recession, American property is still a wise investment, both for Americans and non-Americans alike. And it should be no surprise that we're now beginning to learn that so many alleged illicit financial networks, Ponzi schemers, again, oligarchs, kleptocrats elsewhere, have turned to the American real estate sector to hide and launder their money, but they're no longer doing it in the Manhattans, the Miamis, the Malibus. One figure that I write about, a Ukrainian oligarch, ended up becoming, with nobody being aware of this, the biggest commercial real estate landlord in Cleveland, Ohio. And he also went to all these small towns, these overlooked towns in places like Kentucky, West Virginia, Texas, Illinois, and purchased these economic crown jewels of these regions, again, steel plants, manufacturing plants, et cetera, promising jobs, promising revitalization, promising reinvestment in these local communities. And as far as anyone can tell, never intending to actually do anything with them. And we've seen the aftermath of that. Again, this is alleged by the Department of Justice. This is alleged by, in this case, Ukrainian regulators. All they did was plow their money in just to keep it safe, just to keep it away from Ukrainian investigators, and to never bring those jobs back. And what we've seen on the ground is that these factories, these steel plants, are slowly beginning to crumble into nothing. These remaining blue-collar jobs are now being wiped out. These American workers are being laid off over and over and over again. And then, by the way, these assets, these factories, these plants are effectively frozen. They can't be seized. They can't be turned over to a new owner. These local communities are watching their economic lifeblood dry up. And again, we're only just learning about this phase of American kleptocracy.
Say, if people do a legitimate investment, they want that investment to pay off. So they would invest more into the factory and try to have it flourish so they could profit. But in this case, since the main point of the investment is to wash your money and make it legal, they don't have to bother putting in any new money. They don't really care about the investment. The point is to just launder the money as opposed to build a business. And that's why a lot of them atrophy and because the mission's already accomplished. All right, so last thing, you also mentioned about how they're infiltrating universities and think tanks here. I guess the how is relatively easy. You go to a think tank, you go, hey, I'm gonna give you $10 million. Their answer is gonna be yes. The question is why? Why are they? Is that a money laundering scheme, or are they buying marketing for themselves?
Well, that's a great question, Sheikh. That is not money laundering in and of itself. It's you can't give a donation of $10 million in dirty money and they get $10 million in clean money out. That is not the element of kleptocracy that is money laundering. This is kind of an emergent field of study in the broader counter-corruption, anti-kleptocracy space of reputation laundering. This is where these kleptocratic figures take the next step. Now they have built this incredible portfolio of anonymous wealth, much of it transformed from dirty, illicit, suspect money into clean, legitimate assets right here in the United States, upending and distorting the broader American economy in and of itself. And now they have more money than they know what to do with. Now they can go to the universities, they can go to the think tanks, they can go to cultural centers, they can go to museums. And now they transform from oligarchs, from kleptocrats. They use these donations to launder their reputations and become tycoons, become businessmen, become philanthropists. I want to couch this by saying this is not a foreign phenomenon. This is a kind of a tried and true American model. As I'm sure you've seen, the Sackler family, their donations to a number of American museums are finally being called into questions, and we're finally seeing those names being brought down because of Sackler family's role in the opioid crisis. But this is a model that these foreign kleptocratic figures are now pursuing. They are bankrolling these significant donations that, again, universities, think tanks are under no compunction to check the source of incomes whatsoever. And these kleptocratic figures are not only transforming themselves into, again, donors and philanthropists, but now they're opening doors for themselves to the kind of who's who of American policymaking, of American cultural tastes. They become moguls. They become backroom dealers. They have access to the elite circles right here in Washington or New York or Los Angeles or Miami or you name it. And none of us are any the wiser. We have no documentation. There's no transparency. And again, this is one of the kind of emergent fields in the anti-corruption, counter-kleptocracy space. But this is what they've done once they've built this war chest of anonymous, illicit wealth, distorted the American economy, looted the populations back home where they originally come from, using and abusing these wide open anti-money laundering loopholes, and then becoming these titans of industry, these philanthropists that everybody should ogle at, everybody should follow, while, by the way, they're in Washington lobbying for their own interests and pursuing their own profits at the end of the day.
I can't stop asking questions, but again, real quick, the American political system allows for unlimited campaign donations, and so either they could become American citizens or they could use a proxy who's an American citizen. So couldn't they, just as well as the Koch brothers or Sheldon Adelson or George Soros, couldn't they put billions into buying American politicians to get anything they want?
Yeah, Cenk, absolutely they could. I mean, I don't need to tell you and the listeners just how wide open or how kind of asleep at the wheel the FEC has been in terms of election finance monitoring, let alone investigations and sanctions and penalties. We've been talking about how wide open the American economy is. The American political system is increasingly wide open to these inflows of financial funds. I mean, there's every incentive for these figures to plow their money not only to American real estate, private equity, the auction house and art market, but now beyond that, politicians themselves, setting up anonymous financial vehicles, or even using American colleagues that are only too happy to anonymously cycle that money into American political parties, into American political figures. And this isn't even talking about some figure like, for instance, Donald Trump, a luxury real estate developer who is saturated in anonymous foreign wealth. And we only have a tiny idea about some of the figures who've been bankrolling Trump properties both before, during, and after his presidency. I mean, these figures are absolutely feasting on this wide open American landscape, both economically and, as we've seen, increasingly politically as well.
Yeah, this stuff was allowed day in, day out by people like Andrew Cuomo. And then golly gee, that people found out that Andrew Cuomo was not a good guy for other reasons when he'd been allowing this stuff forever, because a lot of the real estate interests and private equity and hedge fund guys were his top donors. And golly gee, the media could never figure it out. And now all of a sudden they're shocked and chagrined. Super last thing, is it enough in the real estate market to move prices? Like, is housing less affordable in America because of this money laundering schemes by oligarchs?
The short answer to that is yes. And again, just look at the incentive structure. There's no reason for these oligarchs, kleptocrats to look for any other industry elsewhere. The American real estate market is wide open. We know they've been targeting not just the luxury side, these mansions and condos, but they've increasingly been targeting real estate, residential real estate, homes and houses, single family units, et cetera, as well as apartment buildings, as well as commercial real estate. Absolutely, this has played a role in the increasing housing prices, the rising housing costs here in the United States. What that actual fraction is, what that actual percentage is, remains to be seen. This is absolutely a fertile field for researchers, especially in both the civil society and academic space. Hopefully we'll have a better grasp on what that relationship actually looks like in the coming years. But no, you're absolutely right. Among other things, among inflation costs, among other, lack of actual housing supply, absolutely this has played a role in accelerating housing prices, because we just don't know. We really don't know at the end of the day how many of these oligarchic figures have plowed how much of their money into how many American cities, towns, regions, states, et cetera. There is such a rampant amount of anonymity that we still only have a fraction of an idea. And we're going to have to wait for firmer answers moving forward. But yes, Frank, the short answer is absolutely yes.
All right, Casey Michel, author of American Kleptocracy. Thank you for joining us and shedding a light on this really important issue that hides in dark corners.
Thanks so much, Shank.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.